Dr. Marcus Reed had been called many things in 14 years of practicing medicine. But he had never been told, by a mother clutching her daughter's hospital blanket like a shield, that his hands weren't good enough to touch her child. Vivian Ashford Cole said it quietly, almost politely, the way people say cruel things when they've never once had to apologize for one. She wanted a different doctor. Someone she recognized. Marcus nodded, said nothing he'd regret, and walked out of room 412 without an argument he could have won on the spot. He didn't know that in 10 hours, at 2 in the morning, he'd be the only surgeon inside that hospital who had ever seen what was quietly growing in 9-year-old Presley Ashford Cole's chest. And Vivian didn't know that the man she'd just banned from touching her daughter was about to be the only thing standing between that little girl and a funeral. Founders Regional Medical Center sat on a low rise at the edge of uptown Charlotte, its glass tower catching the morning light in a way that made it look, from the parking deck, like something that had never once failed anybody. Marcus Reed knew better. He'd worked inside that glass for 11 years, and he knew exactly how much of what happened behind it depended on things that had nothing to do with medicine. He arrived, as he always did, at 5:40 in the morning, before the hallways filled with the particular noise of a hospital waking up. Gurney wheels, the beep of a badge reader, someone's radio low in the break room. He liked the quiet. It was the only time the building felt like it belonged to the patients instead of to the people who ran it. The 4th floor smelled the way it always did at that hour. Coffee from the nurse's station, the faint antiseptic sting under everything, and beneath that, if you'd worked in a place like this long enough to know its smaller rhythms, the particular quiet of a unit where sick children were, for a few more hours, still mostly asleep. Marcus had learned to love that smell the way some men love the smell of a workshop or a kitchen. It meant he was somewhere he understood completely, in the breast pocket of his white coat, where most surgeons kept a penlight or a folded reference card. Marcus carried a stethoscope that hadn't been manufactured in over 40 years. The rubber tubing had cracked and been taped in 2 places. The bell was dented on one side, worn smooth on the other from decades of a hand gripping it the same way, morning after morning. Scratched into the metal, so faint you had to already know it was there to find it, were 2 initials, O.R. Odessa Reed. His mother. A registered nurse for 31 years, 22 of them at the hospital that used to stand where this one now stood, Mercy General, torn down and rebuilt into Founders back when Marcus was still in his surgical fellowship in Atlanta. She had died 4 years ago, in a bed 2 floors above the one Marcus now stood beside most mornings, and he had not used her stethoscope to listen to a single heart since. It didn't work well enough anymore for that. He carried it anyway, the way some men carry a wedding ring on a chain after the marriage that made it means something. He touched it now, out of habit, before he pushed open the door to the surgical resident lounge. Dr. Amara Johnson was already there, 2nd-year resident, a stack of pre-op charts in front of her that she'd clearly been reading since before the sun came up. She was 27, sharp enough that Marcus had started giving her cases most attendings wouldn't hand a 2nd year, and tired in the specific way that only people trying to prove something twice as hard as everyone around them get tired. "You're here before me again," Marcus said. "That's not supposed to be possible." "I had a thought about the Delgado kid's shunt placement, and I couldn't sleep until I wrote it down." She didn't look up. "Also, Nurse Okafor told me there's a 9-year-old getting admitted this morning with syncope and a heart murmur nobody can pin down. Cardiology's stumped. They're pulling you in." Marcus felt the small, familiar click of interest that had nothing to do with ego and everything to do with the shape of a puzzle he hadn't seen yet. Vitals? stable right now, but she's fainted 3 times in 6 weeks, and the murmur's inconsistent, sometimes there, sometimes not. That inconsistency is the whole story, if you ask me. It usually is. Marcus poured coffee he wouldn't finish. You ever hear me talk about Al Kappa variants? Once, in a lecture that put half the room to sleep and kept me up for 2 nights afterward. Then, you already know more about this kid's heart than the 3 cardiologists who saw her before you did. He said it without pride, the way he said most true things about his own competence. Flatly. Like a fact he'd stopped needing anyone else to confirm a long time ago. That competence hadn't been handed to him. Marcus had spent 6 years of his career, 3 in fellowship, 3 more afterward, narrowing his focus down to a sliver of pediatric cardiac surgery so specific that fewer than a dozen surgeons in the country did it with any regularity. Hybrid repairs for children born with an anomalous coronary artery tangled around an interrupted aortic arch, a combination rare enough that most surgeons went entire careers without seeing a single case. He had co-developed, with his mentor in Atlanta, a staged reconstruction technique that had cut mortality on the sickest of those cases nearly in half. He'd published on it. Surgeons flew families to Charlotte specifically to sit across from him. None of that would matter in about 3 hours to the woman standing in room 412. An hour before any of that, on the 3rd floor, Amara had her own morning to get through first. She was drawing blood from a 7-year-old with a post-op infection when the boy's father, a contractor from Gastonia with forearms like cinder blocks and a voice that filled the whole room, asked her, not unkindly, when the doctor would be coming by. "I am the doctor," Amara said, the same even tone she used every time this happened, which was often enough that she'd stopped being surprised by it and not often enough that it had stopped costing her something small each time. "Dr. Johnson, I'm one of the surgical residents on your son's care team." "Oh, sorry, the father recalibrated fast, embarrassed, which was its own kind of common. "I just meant, when's the surgeon coming?" "The one who did his repair." "Dr. Reed will be by on rounds within the hour. I can update his chart in the meantime, if that's useful to you." Sure, that'd be great." He watched her cap the blood vial with more attention than the task required. The particular over-friendliness of a man trying to make up, silently, for something he wasn't going to say out loud. It wasn't cruelty. Amara had learned over 2 years of residency that it rarely was, not from people like this, it was reflex. The same reflex Marcus had talked about once in the lounge, unexamined because it had never had to be examined. A picture in someone's head of what a surgeon looked like that her white coat and her badge and her steady hands hadn't yet managed to overwrite. She finished the draw, charted the note, and didn't mention it to anyone. Because mentioning every one of these would have used up hours she didn't have, and energy she needed for the actual medicine. She thought about it anyway, for exactly as long as it took to walk from that room to the next one, which was a discipline she'd built the same deliberate way Marcus had built his stillness. Not because the feeling wasn't real, but because letting it follow her into the next room would have made her worse at the only thing that was actually going to change anybody's mind about her, which was being right, competently and repeatedly, until being right was the only thing left in the room to notice. She didn't know yet that in about 9 hours she'd watch someone do the exact same thing to Marcus, at a scale that would nearly cost a 9-year-old girl her life. Vivian Ashford Cole had grown up believing that competence had a look, and that the look was one she'd know the moment she saw it. Her father built a logistics company from nothing into something that had his name on 2 buildings downtown, and he had taught her, mostly by example, that the world sorted itself cleanly into people who belonged in a room and people who were, at best, useful inside it. He hadn't taught her this cruelly. He'd taught it to her the way you teach a child which fork to use, as manners, not malice. It had simply never once been tested, in 61 years of his life, or 38 of hers, because the rooms she moved through had always confirmed it for her. She sat now in a vinyl chair beside her daughter's hospital bed, Presley's small hand in both of hers, and she was doing the thing frightened parents do in hospitals, turning fear into control. Because control was the only language she had ever needed to speak fluently. "Where's the actual cardiologist?" she said. Not quite a question, when Nurse Denise Okafor came in to check vitals. The one from the consult yesterday said someone from cardiac surgery would be looking at her file. "Doctor, Reed's the surgeon who'll be doing your consult this morning," Denise said. "He's the best we've got for exactly this kind of case. You're lucky he's on staff here. A lot of hospitals this size don't have anyone with his subspecialty." Vivian nodded, already only half listening. Already composing in her head the list of donor connections she'd start working through the second this stopped being handled to her satisfaction. Presley, small against the pillows, IV taped to the back of one hand, watched the door with the alertness of a kid who had learned, over 6 weeks of fainting spells and worried adults, to read a room before anyone spoke in it. At 7:50, the door opened, and Marcus Reed walked in. He was tall, unhurried, wearing the white coat over navy scrubs, a lanyard with a hospital badge that read Dr. Marcus Reed, Pediatric Cardiothoracic Surgery. He carried Presley's chart under one arm and had already read it twice. "Good morning," he said to Presley first, which was a habit he'd built deliberately over the years. "Greet the patient before the parent. Every time. No exceptions." "I'm Dr. Reed. I hear you've been giving everybody quite a scare." Presley managed a small smile. "I didn't mean to." "I know you didn't." He pulled the rolling stool close to the bed, sat at her eye level instead of standing over her. "I'm going to listen to your heart, and I'm going to ask you some questions that might feel a little repetitive, because I already read what you told the other doctors, but I want to hear it in your words. Is that okay?" Okay. He hadn't looked at Vivian yet. It wasn't a slight. It was simply not, in his professional order of operations, where his attention belonged first. "I'm her mother," Vivian said, standing now, arms crossed loosely, the posture of a woman used to being addressed within the first 30 seconds of any interaction. Vivian Ashford Cole. "I'd like to understand your background before we go any further. This is our daughter's heart we're talking about." "Of course." Marcus straightened, met her eyes, offered his hand. "Marcus Reed. I'm a cardiothoracic surgeon, subspecialized in pediatric congenital repairs. I've been on staff here for 11 years. Vivian didn't take the offered hand right away. Her eyes moved over him in the particular half-second sweep Marcus had learned, over 2 decades of medicine, to recognize instantly, the sweep that wasn't about his coat or his badge or the chart under his arm, but about something else entirely. Something that had already half decided before he'd said a single clinical word. "Where did you train?" she asked. "Morehouse School of Medicine." "Fellowship at Emory. Subspecialty fellowship at Boston Children's." "And you've done this before? This specific, whatever it is you think is going on with her? I won't know exactly what's going on with her until I get a look at her imaging and run a few tests this morning. But if her presentation matches what I suspect, then yes. I've done this before. It's actually the area I focus on almost exclusively." He kept his voice level, informational, the same tone he'd use with any parent. "I'd like to start with an echocardiogram and a CT angiogram, and then I'll come back and walk you through exactly what we're looking at." Vivian's arms stayed crossed. "I think," she said, I'd feel more comfortable with Dr. Callahan's team handling this. I understand he's the chief of surgery here. Doctor, Callahan's a general thoracic surgeon. This is a pretty narrow subspecialty. He'd tell you the same thing I'm telling you, that this is exactly the kind of case that gets referred to someone like me. I'd still like a second opinion. Before anyone touches her. Marcus had had this conversation before, in one shape or another, more times than he let himself count anymore. Parents nervous about surgery. Parents who'd read too much on the internet at 3 in the morning. Parents who simply needed reassurance dressed up as skepticism. He was patient with all of it, because fear made people say things they didn't fully mean. But there was something underneath this particular version of it that he recognized too, and had learned, a long time ago, not to name out loud in the room, because naming it never once made it go faster or easier for the child in the bed. That's absolutely your right, he said. I'll have the nursing staff pull my full credential file for you, and Dr. Callahan can walk you through it if that would help. In the meantime, with your permission, I'd like to go ahead and order the echo and CT so we don't lose time. Those are just imaging studies, nothing invasive, and they'll help whoever ultimately handles her care. Vivian looked at her daughter, then back at Marcus, something calculating behind the worry now. Fine, she said. The tests. Not you. Presley's small hand tightened on the blanket. Marcus nodded once, wrote the orders, and left the room without another word, because there wasn't one that would have changed anything, and he had 11 years of practice not spending his energy on the ones that wouldn't. Denise Okafor caught him in the hallway, her voice pitched low. You okay? I'm fine, he said, and mostly meant it. Get me those images the second they're up. I want eyes on this before the day gets away from us. By 9 that morning, Vivian Ashford Cole was on the phone in the family consultation room with Dr. Thomas Callahan, chief of surgery. A soft-spoken man in his late 50s who had built his entire career on a foundation of never, under any circumstances, telling a hospital donor no. The Ashford Cole family cardiac wing had opened on the 4th floor 2 years earlier. Vivian's late father-in-law's foundation had put up $11 million for it. There was a plaque in the lobby. There was, more relevantly to Thomas Callahan in this exact moment, a pledge for a second capital campaign currently sitting, unsigned, in a folder on Vivian's desk at home. I'm not trying to make trouble, Vivian said, in the tone people use directly before making trouble. I just want the best possible care for my daughter, and I'd feel more comfortable with someone whose background I understand a little better. Of course, Callahan said. Doctor, Reed is excellent, Vivian. I want to be clear about that. But if it would put you at ease, I can absolutely have Dr. Whitfield consult instead. Peter's very experienced, very well regarded. Is he as specialized as Dr. Reed? There was a pause on the line that Vivian didn't notice, and Callahan hoped she wouldn't. He's an excellent general pediatric cardiac surgeon, Callahan said, which was true, and which answered a question she hadn't quite asked. That's what I'd prefer. And, Thomas, I don't want this to be awkward for anyone, I really don't. I just don't want Dr. Reed on her case at all. Not consulting, not in the room, nothing. I'll feel better. Callahan looked for just a moment at the folder on the corner of his desk that he hadn't opened yet, the one with the Ashford Cole Foundation letterhead visible through the tab. I understand completely, he said. I'll have it noted in her chart. He called Peter Whitfield next, and it was, in its own quieter way, a harder conversation than the one he'd just had. I need you to pick up the Ashford Cole girl, Callahan said. 9-year-old, syncope, unclear murmur, echoes up in the system now. Reed was slated for the consult, but the families requested someone else. There was a pause on Whitfield's end long enough that Callahan felt it. Requested someone else how? Whitfield asked. Requested a different subspecialty, or requested a different. He didn't finish the sentence either, which told Callahan that he didn't need to. The family's a significant hospital donor, Peter. I'd like this to go smoothly. That's not what I asked. I'm aware of what you asked. Callahan's voice tightened slightly. Can you take the case or not? Whitfield looked at the echo image already open on his second monitor, the anatomy unfamiliar enough that he'd have said, to anyone but his boss, that he'd want Reed's eyes on it before he committed to a plan. He was 49 years old, well-liked, competent, and had built an entire quiet, comfortable career on never once being the surgeon who made things difficult for the hospital that employed him. I can take it, he said. I'll want imaging support if anything looks unusual. That's all I'm asking, Callahan said, and hung up before either of them had to say anything truer than that out loud. Whitfield sat for a moment with his hand still on the phone, looking at the strange, unfamiliar loop of the coronary artery on his screen, telling himself the thing careful men tell themselves right before they make a decision they'll spend a long night regretting, that it was probably fine, that he'd watch it closely, that Reed's resident would flag anything he missed. That night, unable to sleep, Vivian did the thing she told herself she wasn't doing while she was already doing it. She searched Marcus Reed's name. She found a hospital bio with his credentials listed plainly. Morehouse, Emory, Boston Children's, 11 years on staff. She found a photograph of him at a medical conference in Chicago, standing at a podium in front of a slide dance with anatomical diagrams she didn't understand. She found a journal abstract with his name second on the author line. Something about staged reconstruction outcomes in anomalous coronary anatomy with concomitant arch interruption. Language so far outside anything she could evaluate that she scrolled past it twice without absorbing a word of it. She found on the hospital's own website a short profile quoting a mother from Savannah who had flown her son to Charlotte specifically for Dr. Reed, calling him, in the specific worn language of parents who mean it completely, the reason my son is alive. None of it moved her the way it should have. She sat with the laptop glowing in the dark of her kitchen and felt the information arrive and simply fail to land anywhere that mattered, the way a fact sometimes bounces off a feeling that got there first and has no intention of moving. She closed the laptop and told herself, again, that it wasn't about him specifically. That she just wanted someone she was comfortable with. That comfort was a reasonable thing for a frightened mother to want. She did not ask herself, that night, why comfort had looked, so immediately and so specifically, like a particular kind of face. Marcus found out from Amara, 40 minutes later, standing in the hallway outside radiology, with Presley's echo already pulled up on the shared workstation, an image he'd been staring at for the last 10 minutes with the specific, quiet intensity of a man who has just found exactly what he suspected he'd find. They pulled you off the case, Amara said, keeping her voice down, glancing over her shoulder like the words themselves might get her in trouble. Callahan's assigning Whitfield instead. It's already in the chart. Marcus didn't answer right away. He looked back at the echo image, at the faint wrong geometry of a coronary artery that didn't originate where it should, curling instead around the aortic arch in a pattern he had seen exactly 11 times in his career, 7 of them in the last 4 years alone. Because families with children who had this specific anomaly had started flying to Charlotte specifically because he was here. Does Whitfield know what he's looking at? Marcus asked. I don't know. I don't think anyone's shown him this yet. Marcus exhaled slowly through his nose, a habit from residency he'd never fully broken, the closest thing to visible anger he allowed himself in a hospital hallway. Send him the imaging, he said. Flag it. Don't editorialize, just flag it. Anomalous origin, arch interruption. Recommend cardiothoracic subspecialty consult before any surgical planning. You want me to recommend consulting you? When you're the one who just got pulled? I want you to recommend the standard of care, Marcus said. What happens after that isn't up to either of us. He didn't say the rest of it out loud, though Amara heard it anyway. The way you hear the shape of a thing even when someone's too disciplined to say it plainly, that he'd been in this exact hallway before. Different year, different chart, same particular flavor of dismissal, and that the only thing that had ever worked, the only thing that had ever mattered in the end, was making absolutely sure the medicine was right and letting the medicine eventually speak louder than the assumption. He found Callahan in his office at 11, between meetings, and didn't sit down when he was offered the chair. I want to understand something, Marcus said. Was there a clinical reason I was pulled off the Ashford Cole case? Something in her workup? Something about my availability? Anything at all that would show up in a chart review? Callahan set down his pen. The family requested a different surgeon, Marcus. That's within their rights. It's within their rights to request it. It's not within your obligation to grant it without so much as a documented conversation about why the surgeon they're replacing me with has never managed this anatomy before. I'm not asking you to overrule a family's wishes about their own daughter. I'm asking you whether anyone in this building, at any point today, weighed that decision against the fact that a 9-year-old's life might depend on the difference. Peter's a good surgeon. Peter's a good surgeon who told you himself on the phone this morning that he'd want imaging support if anything looked unusual. I heard about that call, Thomas. This building isn't as quiet as you'd like it to be. Marcus kept his voice level, the same register he used in every room, because he had learned decades ago that raising it would only give people a reason to talk about his tone instead of his point. I'm not going to fight you on this today, because fighting you on it doesn't get me back in that room, and it doesn't help that little girl. But I want it on the record, with you, right now, that I flagged this. If something happens on that case that shouldn't happen, I need you to remember this exact conversation. Callahan didn't answer right away. Something in his face suggested, for just a moment, that he understood exactly what he was doing and was choosing to do it anyway, which was, in its own way, worse than not understanding at all. Noted, he said finally. Noted, Marcus repeated, and let himself out without waiting to be dismissed, because there was nothing else in that office he needed. That evening, after his shift, Marcus drove not home but to a modest brick ranch house in a neighborhood 20 minutes east of the hospital, the house he'd grown up in, the house his mother had left him. He still hadn't sold it. He told himself it was because the market was soft. He and his sister both knew it wasn't about the market. He sat on the back porch with a glass of tea he didn't drink and his mother's stethoscope on the table beside him, and he let himself think, for the length of one cigarette he didn't smoke anymore, but still sometimes wanted, about Odessa Reed. She'd started at Mercy General in 1979, one of 4 black nurses on staff in a hospital that employed close to 200. She'd been passed over for charge nurse 3 separate times across 19 years, each time for someone with less seniority and, in 2 of the 3 cases, provably worse outcomes on their unit. She never sued. She never made a scene. She'd told Marcus once, the only time he'd ever heard her talk about it at length, that she'd decided early on that the fight worth having wasn't the fight to be liked in that building. It was the fight to be right often enough, publicly enough, for long enough, that eventually the building couldn't pretend it hadn't noticed. She'd made charge nurse in her 20th year. She'd trained the next 3 generations of nurses who came up under her, half of whom now ran units of their own across 3 different hospital systems in the Charlotte metro. When she died, 41 nurses had come to her funeral in scrubs, straight off shift, because there hadn't been time to change, and they hadn't wanted to miss it. "You don't win the room by making them like you," she used to say. "You win it by making them need you." Liking is a mood. Need is a fact. Build the kind of career they can't afford to be wrong about. Marcus had built exactly that kind of career, and it had just been overruled by a folder with a Foundation's letterhead on it. He thought, sitting there, of a Tuesday afternoon he hadn't let himself remember in years, 16 years old, sitting in the family lounge at Mercy General, waiting for his mother's shift to end, doing algebra homework on his knee, when he'd watched a young attending physician walk briskly past his mother's nursing station, glance at a chart she'd flagged for him that morning, and announce to the family gathered there that he'd caught a medication interaction that could have been serious. Marcus had watched his mother's face. Not angry, not even surprised, just a specific, practiced stillness he would spend the next 25 years learning to recognize in his own reflection, as the family thanked the doctor and never learned her name. He'd asked her about it in the car that night, 16 and furious in the particular, uncomplicated way teenagers are furious on someone else's behalf. "Why didn't you say something?" "You caught it." Not him. Odessa had kept her eyes on the road for a while before she answered. "Because saying something in that moment gets me labeled difficult, and difficult gets remembered a lot longer than credit does," she'd said. "But you know what he can't take from me? The catch. He can have the sentence. I'll keep the skill. 20 years from now, baby, sentences don't save anybody's life. The skill does. You build the skill so big and so undeniable that eventually it doesn't matter whose sentence gets said out loud, because everybody in the building already knows who they're really calling when it's serious." Marcus hadn't fully understood it at 16. He understood it completely now, sitting on his mother's porch with her stethoscope on the table and his own name just erased from a 9-year-old's chart by a man who had never once, in his entire career, had to build anything that undeniable, because nobody had ever needed him to. He picked up his phone and texted Amara, "Keep an eye on the Ashford Cole chart tonight if you can." "Just watch it," she texted back within a minute, already planning to. "Something about that echo isn't sitting right with me either." Dr. Peter Whitfield was a competent surgeon, 49 years old, 20 years of general pediatric cardiac cases behind him, the kind of steady, well-liked physician who had never in his career needed to develop the specific, narrow expertise Marcus had spent a decade building, because the cases that required it had simply never landed on his service before. He looked at Presley Ashford Cole's echo Tuesday afternoon, read the flag Amara had attached to it, and did what a careful, honest doctor does when a junior resident raises a concern he doesn't fully share. He took it seriously enough to order a second imaging study, and not seriously enough to admit, out loud, to the mother sitting across from him, that he was looking at an anomaly he'd only ever read about in textbooks. "I want to be straightforward with you," he told Vivian, in the same consultation room where she'd spoken to Callahan that morning. "There's an unusual finding on her echo. I don't think it's an emergency. Her vitals are stable, the fainting episodes have been isolated, not sustained. My plan is to get a clearer CT image, monitor her overnight, and reassess in the morning with fresh eyes." Is this the same thing Dr. Reed was worried about? There was a flag on the chart from his resident. Yes, I've factored that in. But you don't think it's serious. I think it's worth watching closely. I don't think we need to rush into anything tonight. He said it with genuine confidence. The confidence of a doctor who believed honestly that he was making the careful choice. He did not know, because no one in that hospital had ever needed to teach him, that in an anomalous coronary artery wrapped tight around an interrupted aortic arch, stable could be a temporary agreement the body was making with itself, one that a sudden spike in cardiac demand could break in minutes, not hours. Vivian nodded, relieved in the specific, fragile way of a parent who has just been told what she wanted to hear. "Thank you," she said. "This is exactly the kind of care I was hoping for." Grant Ashford Cole called from his hotel in Chicago at 6 that evening, between meetings, and got the short version of the day from Vivian, Presley stable, a new surgeon on the case, everything under control. "Wait," Grant said. "What happened to Reed? Ellen Marsh told me at the board dinner in April that he's the reason her sister's grandson is walking around today. She said people fly here specifically for him. I wasn't comfortable with him," Vivian said. "I switched her to Dr. Whitfield. He's very well regarded." "Comfortable how?" Vivian felt the question land somewhere she didn't want to look at too closely. "I don't know, Grant, something about him. I didn't like how the whole thing felt." Vivian, Grant's voice, usually easy, had gone careful in a way she wasn't used to hearing from him. "Our daughter has something wrong with her heart that 3 cardiologists couldn't figure out. If there's one guy in that building who actually specializes in whatever this turns out to be, I don't care what feeling you had about him in the first 90 seconds. I want him on her case. I've already spoken to Thomas. It's handled." "It doesn't sound handled. It sounds like you replaced a specialist with a generalist because of a feeling." He exhaled, and she could picture him rubbing his eyes the way he did when he was choosing his next words carefully. "I'm not trying to fight with you from 600 miles away. I'm asking you to think about whether the feeling is actually about him or about something else, before it's the only version of this doctor our daughter gets." "I have thought about it," Vivian said, more sharply than she meant to. "I'd like to focus on Presley, not on relitigating a decision I've already made." Grant didn't push further, not because he agreed, but because he was 600 miles away and knew, from 15 years of marriage, exactly which arguments could be won by phone and which couldn't. He told her he loved her, said he'd be on the first flight back in the morning, and hung up with a low, unresolved feeling in his chest that he wouldn't be able to name until much later that night, when his phone rang again just after 2 a.m. with Callahan's number on the screen. Presley had a smaller episode that afternoon, one nobody in the room fully registered for what it was. She was sitting up in bed working on a word search when she went quiet mid-sentence, her hand drifting to her chest, her face losing color for perhaps 4 seconds before it came back. Amara, charting nearby, caught it and crossed the room immediately. "Presley, you okay, sweetheart?" My chest felt funny. Just for a second. Presley's color was already returning, her breathing steady again. "It's gone now." Amara checked her pulse, her oxygen saturation, both normal within the range they'd been running all day. She documented it precisely: transient chest discomfort, resolved spontaneously, vitals within baseline immediately post-episode, and paged Whitfield, who reviewed the note 20 minutes later between 2 other consults. Probably anxiety, or a residual flutter from the arrhythmia we already knew about, he told Amara over the phone. "Keep her on the monitor, and page me if it happens again with any vital sign changes attached to it." Amara hung up and stood in the hallway for a moment, the particular unease of a second-year resident who has a bad feeling she doesn't yet have the seniority to act on unilaterally. She thought about texting Marcus. She almost did. She told herself it was a 4-second episode with normal vitals, that Whitfield was an experienced surgeon who'd made a reasonable call, that she was a resident 6 months out of intern year and not yet the kind of doctor whose gut got to overrule an attending's clinical judgment on its own. She didn't text him. It was a decision she would think about, on and off, for the rest of that year. Marcus wasn't on call that night. He'd checked the schedule out of habit anyway, the way he always did when a case he cared about was still moving through the building without him. He was home, half asleep on the couch with a rerun of a nature documentary running low in the background, when his phone rang at 1:52 a.m. It was Denise Okafor. "Marcus, I know you're off. I need you to hear me out before you say anything." He was already sitting up. "Talk." Presley Ashford Cole crashed 40 minutes ago. Sudden onset chest pain, then arrhythmia, then a drop in perfusion to her left arm we can't explain with a standard read. "Whitfield's here. He's good. But he's on the phone with 2 different cardiac imaging consults right now trying to figure out what he's looking at, and he just said, I heard him say it myself, that he's never managed a live case with this specific anatomy before." Marcus was already up, already reaching for yesterday's scrubs on the chair by the door. "Coronary origin," he said. "Left side, wrapping posterior to the arch?" "That's what it looks like on the fresh CT. "Yeah, and the arch, is it interrupted just distal to the left subclavian?" A pause. "How did you?" "Because I've seen this exact anatomy 11 times in my career, and Whitfield's seen it 0, Marcus said, already moving toward his car, keys in hand. "That's not a criticism of him. It's a fact about the odds. Denise, listen to me. If her perfusion's dropping, and the coronary's compressed against that arch defect, she does not have until morning. She might not have until I get there if this keeps progressing at the rate you're describing." "I know. That's why I'm calling you and not Callahan first." "Is Vivian Ashford Cole in the building?" "She's in the family waiting area. She hasn't left since the crash call went out." "Okay." Marcus pulled out of his driveway, the porch light of his mother's old house shrinking in the mirror behind him. "I'm 11 minutes out. Tell Whitfield everything I just told you. And tell him I'm coming in, not to take his case from him, but because he needs a second set of hands who's actually done this repair before, and there is exactly one of those in this city tonight." "And the mother?" Marcus was quiet for a second, merging onto the empty freeway, streetlights strobing overhead. "Somebody's going to have to tell her," he said. "I'd rather it be the truth than a version of it that lets her feel better for another 20 minutes she doesn't have to spare." Vivian Ashford Cole was sitting in the family waiting area at 2:04 a.m. When Dr. Thomas Callahan, called in from home, came to find her, his tie missing, his shirt wrinkled from being pulled on in a hurry. "Vivian," he sat across from her, his voice carrying the particular gentleness reserved for the worst kind of news. "Presley's had a serious cardiac event. Dr. Whitfield and the team are stabilizing her right now, but the anatomy involved it's rarer than we initially understood, and it requires a very specific surgical approach. I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear all of it before you respond." Vivian's hands had gone white around each other in her lap. "Tell me." "There is exactly one surgeon on staff at this hospital who has performed this specific repair before. Multiple times, successfully. It's Dr. Reed." The room seemed to tilt slightly around her. "I banned him from her case," she said, very quietly, as if hearing the sentence out loud for the first time made it real in a way it hadn't been that morning. "You did," Callahan said, and to his credit, he didn't soften it. Because there wasn't time left to soften anything. "He's already on his way in. He's coming whether you want him in that room or not. Because Whitfield asked for him. Because I'm asking for him. And because right now, your daughter needs the person in this building who actually knows what he's looking at. I need to know if you're going to fight that, Vivian, Because if you are, we don't have time for the fight." Vivian looked down at her hands. She thought, in the strange, sideways way the mind moves in the worst moments of a person's life, of her father, of the fork you were supposed to know to use, of 100 rooms she had walked into certain she already knew who belonged in them. "No," she said. "No, whatever he needs. Whoever he needs. Just please, save my daughter." Marcus arrived at 2:17 a.m., moving through the hospital doors at a pace just short of a run, and found Whitfield waiting for him just outside the corridor, already gowned. Relief plain on his face in a way that had nothing to do with ego, and everything to do with a good doctor recognizing, fast, when the smartest thing he could do was step aside for someone who knew more than he did. "She's stable enough to get to the table." "Barely," Whitfield said, falling into step beside him. "Coronaries compressed against the arch defect exactly like you described on the phone. I've never done the reconstruction you developed, I've read your papers, I understand the theory, but I've never had hands on it live. Then, you're going to assist, and I'm going to talk you through every step out loud the entire time, because if something happens to me in the next 6 hours, I need you to be able to finish this." Whitfield didn't argue. There wasn't an ounce of the morning's politics left in him, just a surgeon who badly wanted the child on his table to live. "Her mother's outside," Whitfield said, as they reached the scrub sinks. "She knows. Callahan told her everything." Marcus scrubbed in silence for a moment, the water running warm over hands that had done this exact repair 11 times before, that knew, with the particular certainty of true expertise, exactly what they were about to do. "It doesn't change anything about how I do this," he said finally. "It never has." 2 hours into the repair, with Presley's chest open and her heart temporarily supported by bypass, Marcus found what he'd expected to find, and one thing he hadn't. The anomalous coronary wasn't just compressed against the interrupted arch, it had begun to show early signs of ischemic damage along one wall, thinner and more fragile than the imaging had suggested. "Talk to me," Whitfield said, watching Marcus's hands go still for a half-second over the field. "Vessel walls more friable than the CT showed. If I rush the reconstruction here, it tears, and we lose the whole repair." Marcus's voice stayed level, the same register he used for everything, urgent or not. "I need another few minutes on this section than I planned. Anesthesia, how's she tolerating bypass time?" "Numbers are holding, but I'd like to know your ceiling," the anesthesiologist said. "Give me 20 minutes before you start getting nervous out loud. If it goes past 30, we'll talk." Marcus's eyes didn't leave the field. "Peter, I need you on retraction, steady pressure. Don't let that vessel move on me even a millimeter." "You've got it." The next 18 minutes passed in near silence, broken only by the rhythmic sound of the bypass machine and Marcus's low, running narration, not for himself but for Whitfield. Because a man who might need to finish this someday deserved to understand every decision as it was being made, not just watch it happen. "See how I'm angling the graft here? Instead of straight across. That's the whole trick with a friable vessel like this one. You're not fighting the tissue, you're working with the angle it already wants to lie at." He worked in small, unhurried movements, nothing about his hands suggesting the tightening tension in the room. Anybody who tells you speed is the priority in a repair like this has never had to explain to a mother why a vessel tore on the table. 22 minutes, anesthesia said quietly. "I hear you." Marcus placed the final suture, checked it again, releasing the graft now. "Watch the color." For 3 seconds, nothing happened, the particular held-breath silence of an operating room waiting on a piece of tissue to decide something on its own. Then the vessel pinked, flow restoring evenly along its length, and the monitor's rhythm, which had been holding on bypass support, began, slowly, to show the shape of a heart doing its own work again. "There it is," Marcus said, something loosening almost imperceptibly in his shoulders. "That's what we wanted to see. Peter, you can ease off retraction. Let's get her weaned off bypass and see how she holds on her own." She held. It took another 2.5 hours to close, methodically, without a single wasted motion, but the hardest 10 minutes of the surgery were already behind them, and everyone in that room, including a resident watching through the observation glass with her hands white-knuckled around a coffee she still hadn't touched, felt it the moment the tension broke. The surgery took 5 hours and 11 minutes. Amara stood at the observation window for the first 90 minutes, until Callahan sent her to get some sleep before her own shift started, though she didn't sleep, just sat in the resident lounge with her hands wrapped around a coffee she didn't drink, listening to the hallway for any sound that might tell her something before the official word came. Vivian Ashford Cole did not go home. She sat in the surgical family waiting room in the same chair for 5 hours, her husband Grant beside her by hour 2, having driven in from a business trip the second Callahan called him, and for most of those 5 hours she said almost nothing at all, because there was nothing she trusted herself to say that wouldn't come apart in the saying. At 7:28 a.m., Marcus Reed walked into that waiting room still in his surgical cap, mask pulled down around his neck, exhaustion carved into his face in the particular way that only shows up after the kind of surgery where every single minute mattered. Vivian stood so fast her chair scraped backward against the floor. "She's stable," Marcus said, before anyone could ask, because he had learned a long time ago that the first sentence out of a surgeon's mouth in that room should never make a family wait 1 extra second for the only information that mattered. "The repair went the way we needed it to go. Her heart rhythm's holding, the coronary flow is where it should be. She's not out of the woods completely, the next 48 hours matter, but I am cautiously, genuinely optimistic. I wasn't sure I'd be able to say that 6 hours ago." Vivian's legs seemed to give slightly, and Grant caught her arm. "Can I?" Her voice broke. "Can I see her?" "In about an hour, once she's settled in recovery. Amara will come get you." Vivian nodded, tears now moving freely down her face, and then she did something that surprised everyone in the room, including, for a moment, herself. She stepped forward, close enough that Marcus had to consciously not step back, and she looked directly at him, at the exhaustion in his eyes, at the badge on his coat that read the name she had refused to let touch her daughter 12 hours earlier. "I am so sorry," she said. "I know that's not enough. I know it's not even close to enough. But I don't know what else to say to you right now except that I was wrong, and you saved my daughter's life, and I will spend as long as it takes trying to understand exactly how wrong I was." Marcus looked at her for a long moment. He was too tired, and had been through too much in the last 5 hours to feel anything as clean as anger or as easy as forgiveness. What he felt instead was something quieter and more complicated. The particular fatigue of a man who has just done the hardest, best work of his career for a family that had, hours earlier, decided he wasn't good enough to be trusted with it. "I wasn't in that room tonight for you," he said, evenly, not unkindly. "I was in it for her. That's the only reason any of this went the way it did, because the thing I know how to do doesn't change depending on who's willing to let me do it." Vivian absorbed that in silence. "I'd like to understand," she said finally. "Not today. I know today isn't the day. But when there's time, I'd like to understand how I got somewhere like this. How I looked at the one doctor who could actually save her, and I only saw—" She stopped herself, unable to finish the sentence in front of him, which was, in its own way, the most honest thing she'd said all night. "When there's time," Marcus said. "Right now, get some rest. Your daughter's going to need you steady when she wakes up." He left the waiting room without waiting for a response, because he had a post-op note to write and 40 other things that mattered more, in that moment, than being thanked by someone who had spent the day before treating his competence as a question mark instead of the fact it had always been. Presley Ashford Cole woke up 9 hours later, groggy, a breathing tube recently removed, her mother's hand already wrapped around hers before her eyes had fully opened. "Hi, baby," Vivian whispered. Presley's eyes found her, then drifted, searching the room, until they landed on Marcus, standing near the foot of the bed reviewing her chart. "Dr. Reed," she said, voice raspy but clear. "You came back." "I did," Marcus said, coming closer, sitting on the same rolling stool he'd used 2 mornings before, at her eye level again, the same as always. "You gave everybody quite a scare last night. Even more than before. Did you fix it? The thing that was wrong?" "I did. It's fixed. You're going to have a scar to show off, and you're going to need to take it easy for a while. But your heart's working exactly the way it's supposed to now." Presley smiled, small and tired, and then looked at her mother, and then back at Marcus, with the particular clarity children sometimes have about things adults spend hours trying not to say plainly. "Mom didn't want you to be my doctor," she said. "But you were the only one who could fix it." The room went very quiet. "Sometimes," Marcus said gently, "the people who are right for the job aren't always the ones somebody expects. That's all right. What matters is you're going to be just fine." Vivian didn't say anything. She simply looked at her daughter's hand in hers, and then at the man who'd put it back there to hold it all. Denise found Amara in the break room an hour later, still holding the same coffee. Cold now, untouched. "You should go home," Denise said, sitting down across from her. "Your shift doesn't start for 3 hours. I don't think I could sleep if I tried." Amara finally set the coffee down. "I keep thinking about the chest pain yesterday afternoon. The 4-second one. I almost texted him about it. Denise, I stood in the hallway with my phone in my hand, and I talked myself out of it, because I didn't think it was my place to second-guess an attending's call on a 4-second episode with normal vitals. You did everything right by the book. You documented it, you paged the attending on the case, you followed the chain. The chain almost got her killed." Denise didn't try to talk her out of the feeling, because she'd had versions of it herself too many times to pretend it wasn't real. The chain's supposed to have redundancy built into it precisely, so one person's hesitation doesn't end up being the only thing standing between a kid and a bad outcome. You're not the redundancy that failed here, Amara. The system that pulled Reed off in the first place is the redundancy that failed. Don't let anybody, including yourself, put that on you instead of where it actually belongs. Amara was quiet for a moment. I want to be good enough, someday, that nobody in this building ever has to wonder whether the 4-second episode was real. You already are, Denise said. You just haven't had 11 years yet to make everybody else catch up to it. That part's not about you. That part's about them. The days that followed moved the way hospital days always do after the worst of a crisis has passed. Slowly, then all at once. Presley was moved out of the ICU on day 3, discharged on day 9, with a scar down her sternum she would, within a year, described to anyone who asked as the coolest thing that ever happened to me. Internally, at Founders Regional, the days that followed moved differently. An anonymous complaint, though it wasn't hard for anyone paying attention to guess it had come from Denise Okafor, backed quietly by 3 other nurses on the unit, reached the hospital's medical ethics board within a week, detailing how a donor family's preference had led directly to a specialist being removed from a case for reasons that had nothing to do with clinical judgment, and everything to do with what Vivian Ashford Cole had, in the complaint's carefully clinical language, perceived about the surgeon based on factors unrelated to his qualifications. Thomas Callahan was called before the board twice. The second time, a physician on the ethics committee, a retired obgyn named Dr. Patricia Nwosu, who had sat on that board for 9 years and had grown tired, in that time, of watching it decline to ask hard questions, put it to him plainly. Dr. Callahan, I want to make sure I understand the timeline correctly. You knew Dr. Reed was the most qualified surgeon on staff for this specific anatomy. You reassigned him anyway, at the family's request, without a documented clinical reason. And the family in question had an active, unsigned pledge with the hospital foundation at the time you made that call. The pledge wasn't a factor in my clinical decision-making, Callahan said. I didn't ask if it was a factor in your clinical decision-making. There wasn't any clinical decision-making. That's rather the point. I asked if you were aware of it. Callahan was quiet for a moment. I was aware of it, he said finally. Thank you for your honesty, Nwosu said, not unkindly, though the words carried the particular weight of someone writing something down that would outlast the conversation. That's what we needed to know. He did not lose his position. Founders Regional was not, in the end, a hospital eager to publicly humiliate its own chief of surgery, but a new policy emerged within 6 weeks, unglamorous and mostly invisible to anyone outside the building, that stripped hospital administration of the ability to reassign a specialist off a case based on a family's request alone, absent a documented clinical concern reviewed by a second physician. The policy got a bland internal name and no press release. Marcus heard about it secondhand from Amara, who'd read it posted in the surgical break room and felt, reading it over her shoulder, something closer to grim satisfaction than triumph. It hadn't cost anyone their job, but it had cost the hospital its ability to let this happen quietly again. And quietly was the only way it had ever worked before. Callahan called Marcus into his office once, near the end of that month, and offered an apology that was, if not eloquent, at least specific, an admission that he'd known, in the moment he told Vivian yes, that he was making the wrong call, and had made it anyway because the folder on his desk had felt, in that particular moment, more urgent than it should have. Marcus accepted it the way he accepted most things that couldn't be undone. Without warmth, without cruelty, and without spending more energy on it than it deserved. Vivian Ashford Cole did not disappear from the story the way antagonists in this kind of case sometimes do. Quietly humiliated, quietly gone. She stayed, uncomfortably, in the middle of it, because she had decided, somewhere in the 5 hours she'd spent in that waiting room, that disappearing from her own mistake would be its own kind of cowardice. She requested a meeting with Marcus 3 weeks after Presley's discharge, not to be forgiven, she was careful to say, but to understand. They met in his office, a small, unglamorous room with a single window and a shelf of journals he'd published in. She noticed, sitting across from him, the cracked stethoscope on the corner of his desk, initials worn nearly smooth. That's not standard hospital equipment, she said. It was my mother's. She was a nurse here, back when this building was still Mercy General. 31 years. He didn't elaborate further, and Vivian, for the first time in the whole encounter, had the sense not to push. I've spent 3 weeks, she said instead, trying to understand why I did what I did. I keep landing on the same answer, and I don't like it very much. I think I've spent my whole life in rooms where the people who looked like me were the ones in charge, and the people who didn't were the ones serving coffee or cleaning up after. And I never once had to notice that I'd built an entire assumption out of that, because nothing ever forced me to test it. Until you were standing in my daughter's room, and some reflex I've never had to examine just fired. And I let it. Because I've never had to pay for it before. Marcus listened without interrupting, the same patient stillness he brought to every difficult conversation in his career. I'm not telling you that to be absolved, Vivian continued. I know it doesn't undo the 12 hours she spent with the wrong doctor because of me. I'm telling you because I don't want to be the kind of person who has an experience like this and changes nothing about herself once the fear wears off. I'd like to do something that isn't just an apology. Something that actually costs me something, if that makes sense. It does, Marcus said. What did you have in mind? What she had in mind, it turned out, was substantial. Over the following months, the Ashford Cole Family Foundation, the same foundation whose letterhead had once sat, unsigned, on Thomas Callahan's desk as unspoken leverage, established a fully funded fellowship for Black medical residents pursuing pediatric cardiac subspecialties, structured deliberately to cover the additional years of fellowship training that made expertise like Marcus's possible in the first place. The kind of training that was often financially out of reach for residents without generational wealth behind them. Vivian insisted, over Marcus's initial and genuine discomfort, that it be named the Odessa Reed Fellowship. She's the reason I'm alive to argue with you about this, Marcus told her, the day she proposed it. I know, Vivian said. That's exactly why. Amara Johnson became its first recipient the following year. The announcement ceremony was small, held in the same fourth-floor lobby where the Ashford Cole Family Cardiac Wing plaque hung. Maybe 40 people gathered with coffee and paper cups before the start of a Thursday shift. Vivian spoke for less than 3 minutes, no notes, her voice steady until the last line. A year ago, I made a decision about my daughter's care based on nothing but a reflex I'd never once been asked to examine, she said. It nearly cost Presley her life, and it should have cost me a great deal more than it did. I can't undo that day. What I can do is make sure it's harder for the next family in this hospital to make the same mistake, and easier for the next Dr. Reed to become exactly who he already was before any of us were smart enough to notice. She didn't look at Marcus while she said it. She'd told him beforehand she wasn't sure she could get through it if she did. Amara, called up to accept the first fellowship on behalf of a program that would eventually fund 6 residents across 4 hospital systems in the Carolinas, kept her own remarks shorter and considerably drier in a way that made Marcus, standing near the back with his arms crossed, have to look down at his shoes for a second so nobody would see him smile. I'd like to thank the committee, Amara said, and I'd like to note, for the record, that I am extremely good at my job, and it only took the hospital 11 years and 1 near catastrophe to build a program that assumes that about people who look like me from the start instead of at the end. The room laughed, the particular relieved laughter of people who needed permission to find something true funny instead of only heavy, and Denise Okafor, sitting in the second row, caught Marcus's eye and mouthed, unmistakably, that girl is going to be just fine. Marcus thought, watching her step down from the small podium, of a stethoscope in a frame on his office wall, and of a woman who'd never gotten a ceremony like this one, who'd built the road anyway, 1 shift at a time, for 31 years, because she'd decided a long time before he was born that the fight worth having wasn't the fight to be liked. He thought she would have liked this room. He thought she would have found the applause a little embarrassing, and the fellowship itself the only part that actually mattered. 1 year to the week after Presley Ashford Cole's surgery, Marcus Reed stood in a hallway on the 4th floor of Founders Regional, the Ashford Cole Family Cardiac Wing, The plaque in the lobby unchanged, though what happened underneath that name had changed considerably. Watching Amara walk a set of nervous parents through an echocardiogram, her voice steady, her explanations clear, the particular calm competence Marcus recognized, because he'd spent a year deliberately building it into her the same way someone had once built it into him. He'd stopped by his mother's house that morning before his shift, the way he still did most anniversaries that mattered to him, even when the calendar didn't officially call them anniversaries. He'd sat on the back porch for 10 minutes with a cup of coffee he actually drank this time, looked out at a yard his sister kept mowed even though nobody lived there, and said, out loud, to no one, the way he did every so often when the porch was quiet enough to hold it, 28 kids came through my or this year who wouldn't have, 10 years ago. Because of what you built before I was old enough to understand you were building it. Then, he'd finished his coffee, locked the door behind him, and driven to work like it was any other Thursday. Because in every way that mattered to the job in front of him, it was. Presley Ashford Cole came in for her 1-year follow-up that same afternoon. 10 years old now, taller, her scar faded to a thin pale line she liked to show her classmates at show and tell, according to Vivian, with more pride than I show off anything I own. Heart sounds perfect, Marcus told her, listening with his own stethoscope, the modern one, though the old one sat, as it always did now, in a small frame on his office wall rather than his coat pocket, not retired from meaning, just retired from carrying. Its work in that particular sense, finally. Fully done. You're cleared for full activity. No restrictions. Does that mean I can do soccer tryouts? That means you can do soccer tryouts. Presley grinned, and Vivian, standing by the door, caught Marcus's eye over her daughter's head, and there was nothing left in that look that needed saying out loud anymore. It had all already been said, slowly, over a year of a foundation and a fellowship and a policy with a bland internal name, in the only language that had ever actually mattered to either of them, what got done, not what got felt. Some mistakes get apologized for once and forgotten. The ones worth anything get turned into something that outlives the apology.